of Wednesday, November 18th. Going to start right now. We will start with the pledge. Everybody ready? Okay. I pledge allegiance
to
to the flag
of
of
the
the
United
United States of
America
America
and
and
to
to the republic for which it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under
under
God,
God, indivisible,
indivisible, with
with
liberty
liberty and
and
justice
for
for
all.
all. Thank you. Okay, first item on the agenda is the approval of minutes of October 19th, 21st, 22nd, 25th, November 5th, and November 10th. Are there any additions or corrections?
No.
Nope, there being none, they're accepted as presented. Next item on the agenda is a presentation, the Independent Auditor's Report. Ms. Sanders, floor is yours. You're on mute.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me this evening to the Board of Education meeting. I am here to present the results for the June 30th, 2020 audit. I wanted to say thank you very much to Mr. Powell and the staff of the school district for the job that they did in providing us the information for this year's audit. COVID-19 was definitely a challenge with respect to accessing information and auditing information. But whatever we had requested, we received by the district, and we were very proud to be able to present our results this evening. So our auditor's report, it's dated November 12th of 2020, has rendered an unmodified opinion, and that's the highest level of assurance that the Board of Education and Community gets, that the financial statements fairly present in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles in the United States. And it's known as a clean opinion. I wanted to give credit to the school district for maintaining their good financial condition. You know, it's very difficult in this environment. There are many unanticipated expenditures that the district may need to look at going forward. We know about the 20% reductions in state aid. Some of us have heard that they're temporary. Some of us have heard otherwise. I'm not sure that we all know the answer yet. But to the extent that they could be something that's either temporary or permanent, this is the year where you need to have unassigned fund balance. This is the year where you need to have access to funding so that you can continue to deliver those educational services and programs that you want to in a healthy and safe way. And so you have maintained your 4% unassigned fund balance. It's just a little bit underneath the 4% of next year's budget. And real property tax law tells us that that's the maximum that you could have, unfortunately. You do have some reserves. You are using them from a budgetary standpoint operationally. And the reserves that are in accordance with general municipal law and education law. And the Board of Education and the school district are using those also appropriately. To the extent that the community approved capital expenditures and the issuance of debt to go ahead and pay for those expenditures, because of the good financial condition that the school district does have, you have a AAA rating. The amount of money that it costs you to borrow to go ahead and pay for those expenditures is a relatively low interest rate. So I encourage you to look at the debt service schedule in the financial statement. And actually, to the point, you've issued debt twice, okay? The first time that you issued debt was back in 2019. And the debt that you issued was $34,710,000. You received almost a $4 million premium, okay? And so receiving a $4 million premium means for you, the community, that's $4 million that the school district does not have to borrow. And this is because of the financial condition of the district. When this district went ahead and issued debt this past year, and the debt was $9,155,000 in accordance with the voter approval in 2017, you received a premium of $923,000. So that's another $923,000 that does not have to be borrowed. So I think that speaks to the financial condition that you have, that you maintain it, and you're using the funds obviously to do the work that the community authorized you to do. The school district also, according to the voter approval, transferred money from two reserves into the capital project fund. to do work at the two of the elementary schools in accordance with the scope of work that had been communicated to the community. And so that's another good way to evaluate on an ongoing basis a better utilization of funding that I have available, and at the same time not incur additional expenses on behalf of the school district to do that. So, I think this is an interesting year. When you look at your financial results for the year, it looks like, wow, we did really well. We didn't spend all our budget dollars. Well, of course, as your auditor, between the middle of March through the end of the year, educational services looked a little bit different. We didn't have transportation costs. We didn't have co-curricular clubs to the extent. We didn't have school, we didn't have sports. So there were some savings on the budget that when you look at against another year, it looks a little bit different. But to your credit, you went ahead and you put money into the reserves, and you're using these reserves to fund for your subsequent year's budget, okay? And so, as the community remembers, between the reserves and the fund balance, there's $5.7 million that's been used to offset the budgetary costs for 2021. And that comes from the ability to be able to utilize the reserves that you have in place and look at managing your fund balance in a wise way. I issued 3 other documents in addition to the financial statement. One was a report on the extra classroom activity funds. Cash basis report also looks very different from previous years because, as we know, the students were really not involved for the last quarter of the year, okay? But the controls are in place. And so you can see in that report by club or activity by building what the transactions were. I also issued a communication to the Board of Education. It's under the standards of AUC 260. And the document talks about whether or not the standards were to apply in the performance of the audit, and they were. If we had any difficulties in performing the audit, they would be noted in this document. There are none noted. Okay. We talk about the timetable and COVID-19. We're a little bit later this year than we typically are. Obviously, next year, all things going well, we would expect that timetable to look a little bit differently. And then at the tail end of that document, we give you for your view adjusting journal entries. And so the adjusting journal entries that we proposed, the district has agreed to go ahead and post. And these would be based on the timing of when we're performing the audit versus when the district is closing their books and records. As you can appreciate, they're closing their books and records as of June 30th, end of the school year. We're coming in to perform our audit, and we have additional documentation that's available to us from third party that would make us consider an account balance a little bit differently. And so that's predominantly what gave rise to those adjusting journal entries. And the first couple, as you see, have to do with the 20% holdback. In June, no one really knew that that was going to be a situation whereby the funding was not going to be available within an immediate period of time. I also issued a management letter, and just as a reminder, within the internal control structure, we look at that to say whether or not we can rely on it in the performance of our audit. You have a very good internal control structure. This is a $240 million business in round numbers. It's huge. And internal control structures could be either a material weakness or a significant deficiency, which would require a separate report to the Board of Education. I found none of those types of findings, and I did not issue a report. My management letter contains some suggestions with respect to maybe evaluating different procedures in order to handle certain transactions. And I'll look forward to Mr. Powell presenting his corrective action plan to the Board of Education, and we will evaluate that corrective action plan in the context of the subsequent year's audit.
Good, thank you. For those who don't know, we did receive the audit report already in advance, so we could look at all of it. This is a presentation also for the public as well. Thank you for how complete it was, very comprehensive and so on. I'd like to now make a resolution to accept the findings of the report. Do I have a motion?
So moved. So
Are
moved.
there any nays? No? Okay, thank you. And thank you, Ms. Sanders, for the report.
And thank you to the Board of Education for their involvement in the process. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda, the superintendent's report. Dr. Prendergast.
Thank you, Mrs. Berkowitz, and good evening, everyone. Many of our schools celebrated the international holiday of World Kindness Day last week. World Kindness Day presents us with the opportunity to reflect upon one of the most important and unifying human principles, and that is to promote the importance of being kind to each other, to yourself, and to the world. This day has the purpose to help everyone understand that compassion for others is what brings all of us together. While there were so many wonderful activities scheduled in support of World Kindness Day, I did want to highlight the fact that North High School had invited Mr. Sammy Steigman, a survivor of the Holocaust, to speak with our students and our staff. Mr. Steigman is a motivational speaker and a social action agent, and his message was quite clear. Never give up, never lose hope, never be a perpetrator, and never be a bystander. Let's hope that we as a society can embrace this notion of promoting and celebrating kindness in all of its forms. And I want to thank the administrators and the teachers in each of our schools for finding unique ways in which to highlight and recognize all of the good attributes that we expect from our students and from each other. In response to our community's ongoing interest in providing elementary enrichment offerings, the Recreation program will be offering courses in storytelling, creative computing club, public speaking, Shark Tank Club, STEM coding, poetry workshop, paint like the masters, and instrumental essential courses. Registration actually closes by midnight tonight, so I would encourage anyone, if you are interested and have not had yet the chance to register, please check the recreation page on our website for additional information. I'd like to also take this opportunity to offer our congratulations to Mr. Mark Epstein, our recently retired Director of Technology, for being named this year's prestigious Nassau BOCES Fred Podolsky Visionary Award recipient. Mr. Epstein will be formally honored at the virtual Long Island Technology and Education Summit next year. We are so very proud of Mr. Epstein and all of his accomplishments. His time here in Great Neck has been embedded in all that we do. And I also want to acknowledge that also on our agenda this evening, you will note a resolution approving a request from the UPTC to purchase a plaque to be hung at the Phipps Administration Building in honor of Mr. Epstein. The State Education Department has canceled the administration of the January 2021 New York State High School Regents examinations, and this was in response to the ongoing impact to the COVID pandemic. This cancellation applies to all Regents examinations that had been scheduled for January of 2021. Please note, though, as of this point in time, the State Education Department has not yet made any decisions about the June or August of 2021 exams, nor have they made any decisions with regards to the New York State grades 3 through 8 assessments. Now, let's talk a little bit about COVID. As you are aware, our community, our region, and our nation, we are all experiencing a significant rise in COVID cases. Our health experts have warned us that over the next few months, it would present more challenges, and therefore we must remain vigilant in our efforts to protect ourselves and one another. So far, our district has been able to avoid school closures, which is a good sign that our health procedures and prevention policies are working. I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Hickey, our COVID coordinator, along with all of our building administrators for their tiring and ongoing efforts in all that they do to keep us safe. When faced with a positive COVID test, want the community to be reassured that we are working in partnership with the Nassau County Department of Health to conduct contact tracing. Additional information and district protocols followed regarding these confirmed cases are also found on the district website, and we've added that additional information to the letters to the community regarding any positive cases. Our district administrators contact our families as part of the contact tracing process, and the Department of Health contacts those individuals identified as close or proximate contacts and inform them of their next steps. Anyone who is not directly notified can conclude that their child has not been deemed a close or proximate contact, and therefore there's nothing else they need to do at this time. Now, the continued success of maintaining everyone's health and safety requires everyone's cooperation in school and, equally as important, outside of school. We are in close communication with the Department of Health. If the Department of Health designates a specific area in our community as what they call a COVID microcluster zone, restrictions for our schools would be applicable depending on the severity of the outbreak. This would or could include mandated COVID testing and or even the suspension of in-person instruction for schools located in a particular zone or zip code. So with that in mind and recognizing that the holiday season is approaching, colder weather has certainly found its way to our community. Please make sure everyone does their part following all health and safety guidelines. Please remember, avoid large gatherings. Stay home when you're not feeling well or if you're awaiting test results. Contact your medical provider if you are exhibiting any COVID-like symptoms. And please cooperate with the isolation and or quarantine orders that were issued by the Department of Health. And of course, please remember to practice the 3 Ws. Also, keeping in mind with the holidays approaching, folks need to be aware of and be updated with regards to the New York State recently revised travel guidelines and those new restrictions with regards to areas that have been identified. So these changes do come at a time, as we know, when people look to plan to travel or to host a family gathering. But for the health and safety of our school community, we expect everyone to abide by these state requirements, including the mandatory quarantine period. If you, as an individual student, if your child travels to an area that's designated by the state of New York. Our district is working very hard to remain open. We do consult with the Department of Health about each confirmed case, and we are doing everything we need to do to protect our students and staff. Now, I realize the past few months have been challenging, and this is not the time to let our guard down. The health and the safety of our school community is everyone's shared responsibility. However, please keep in mind, we are going to be watching our data points closely. If we find ourselves in a situation where it would warrant a pivoting to a remote instruction for a particular building, you will be notified directly by the district. I know there were some rumors on social media with regards to schools or districts closing. Please know that any information you will be informed directly by the district if that were to occur. I thank you very much, Mrs. Berkowitz. This concludes my report.
Thank you, Dr. Prendergast. The next items on the agenda, items 2D through F. I'd like to turn over to Mrs. Perez, Chair of the Policy Committee.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mrs. Berkowitz. There are 3 policies for your consideration tonight. The first is policy 0110, sexual harassment, and this is for 1 reading and possible adoption. Attached for your consideration is a revised policy. The revision addresses a recommendation from New York State School Boards Association that the word shall will be replaced by the word will throughout the policy to indicate that it is a particular action that is required, not at the discretion of whoever is handling it. In addition, the language has been added to include inferior terms, conditions, or privileges of employment, or examples of potential sexual harassment. In accordance with policy 2400, board policy development, this revised policy is being offered tonight for 1 reading and possible adoption. Are there any questions? Can I hear a motion for adoption, please?
So moved.
So moved.
There being no negatives, thank you very much. The second policy for your consideration this evening is 0115, bullying, cyberbullying, harassment, hazing, and sexting. This is a first reading. It's a very long title. Attached for your consideration is this policy. The revision addresses a proposed change of the title, which was bullying and to just bullying and harassment, so as not to specifically limit the scope of behavior that it encompasses, instead of trying to identify each individual type. New language has been added to the text of the policy indicating that the terms bullying and harassment include, but are not limited to, cyberbullying, hazing, and sexting. In addition, a required bullying and harassment complaint form, this is 0115E has been developed to accompany the policy. We didn't have a specific up-to-date form for the people to fill out. This revised policy and new exhibit are being submitted for a first of 3 readings this evening. There will be no board action taken, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to address them. No? Okay, thank you very much. And the last policy for tonight for your consideration is policy 1120, which is school district records. This is for 1 reading only. The revision addresses a change made by New York State to replace the records retention and disposition schedule, which is ED1, with schedule LGS-1 in accordance with policy 2400, board policy development. This revised policy is being presented to you for 1 reading and possible adoption this evening. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you. Do I hear a motion to adopt?
So moved.
So
So moved.
moved.
I'd like to thank the policy committee, Mrs. Berkowitz, Dr. Prendergast, for your assistance in all of this work. And I miss meeting with you in person. Thank you very much.
As do we. Thank you, Mrs. Perez. Next items, and now I'm going to go, most of this is a consent agenda. Items 2G and H, do I have a motion?
So moved.
So
Are there any
moved.
nays? Item 2I, do I have a motion?
So moved.
So moved.
Are there any nays? This now increases and allows the mechanisms for the credit card payments for the lunch program. Items 2J and K, do I have a motion?
So moved.
Are there any nays? Items 2L and M, do I have a motion?
So moved.
So
Are
moved.
there any nays? Item 2N, do I have a motion?
So moved.
Are there any nays? Item 2O, you heard about already from Dr. Prendergast about the plaque that will be installed at Baker. Do I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
Are there any nays? Items 2P, Q, and R, do I have a motion?
So
So
moved.
moved.
So moved.
Are there any nays? Item 2S as amended, do I have a motion?
So moved.
Any nays? Item 3A, do I have a motion?
So moved.
So
moved.
moved.
Are there any nays? Items 3B through F, do I have a motion?
So
So
moved.
moved.
So moved.
Are there any nays? Item 3H, do I have a motion?
So
So
moved.
moved.
Any nays? Item 3I as amended, do I have a motion?
So moved.
So
Are
moved.
there any nays? Items 4A and B, do I have a motion?
So moved.
So moved.
Any nays? Items 5, 1, A through G, and 5, 2, A through G, do I have a motion?
So moved.
So
So
Are
moved.
moved.
there any nays? Personnel section is quite complicated these days, and that's also because of all of the additional, hopefully temporary staff that we've had to put into place, temporary only on the basis of because of COVID. Now, open time. There were 3 items that were sent to us in advance. I'll start with those. I will read the questions and then call on the appropriate administrator who can answer them. I will start by combining the first 2 because they're very similar. As the COVID situation gets worse, would the district consider moving class to remote learning for a period of time or start the holiday break earlier? It can be accompanied by shortening the second winter recess or spring break. Second question was, in-school students should be tested negative after holiday breaks before returning to school or having 1 week remote school immediately after the breaks. SUNY requires all on-campus students tested negative. School districts should do the same. Nassau positive is over 3% for 3 days. In New York City, 7 days of over 3% results in school shutdown policy, which we've now seen because tomorrow there'll be no school for at least 2 weeks in New York City. Dr. Hickey, would you address these, please?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to. There's also several other COVID-related questions that have come in, so I'm going to try to sum them all up at once and see if we can take care of everybody's questions. I'm going to do that. I'm going to start off by describing the process that we have in place here in Great Neck. I did this with the UPTC presidents yesterday, and it was very helpful. And they asked that I repeat it tonight as well. So while repeating that, I'll be answering a lot of the questions that have been posed to us. Just to give you an example, I'm going to walk you through what happens when we get a COVID positive case. I'll start with the elementary school first. If we get a COVID positive case at the elementary school, we have an internal COVID form that we've developed in Great Neck. The child or staff member is identified, their name, their date of birth, the grade, the building that they are in, their contact information, whether or not they have siblings in district or in a private school in the district, public or private, the names, the grades, the date of birth, and the contact information for those siblings. Whether or not the student takes the bus, we identify what bus route this child was on in the morning, what bus route the child was on in the afternoon. If the child does not take the bus and they carpool, we identify the carpool that they were in and the members that were in that carpool. If the child, not the elementary school children, hopefully, but if the secondary child is driving to school, we identify the driver and any passengers that may be in that car. We identify the teachers, the room number at the elementary level. And then we identify the symptoms. If the child was symptomatic, we check off the symptoms on our form. We identify the date the symptoms began, whether or not the COVID test was a rapid test or a PCR test, the date the test was taken, and the date the results of the test came back. While we're doing this at the elementary level, we also identify all students that were in that class that may have had proximate contact with the student, because at the elementary level, the students eat in the classroom, and we've defined that period of time as the possibility that they may have proximate contact. So again, we're being overly cautious, but we identify every child in that classroom. We then identify the adults that are in that classroom during either lunch or snack period. And then we speak with the classroom teacher to see if there are any other adults that came into that classroom for an extended period of time that may have had proximate contact. We then list all of those contacts, the students and the adults. I contact Dr. Prendergast, who then starts to work on a letter to notify the community. The building level principal or assistant principal or administrator will reach out to anybody that is identified as a contact and let them know. And then we send that information off to the Department of Health. I follow up that faxed information because that's how it's required that it gets faxed. I follow that up with a phone call to confirm that they've received it and answer any questions that they may have. They then begin contact tracing, not automatically right away. That we have an understanding that we've already quarantined everybody. So sometimes it does take a few days. It's taken up to a week in some instances where they actually reach out and make contact to the people that have been quarantined. But in our case, that's okay because we've already quarantined everybody. Every district doesn't have the same process that we have. In some districts, you'll see that if they get a case, they shut down. They don't necessarily have the process where they've done all of the contact tracing that we have. And we basically do it, we gift wrap it, and we hand it to the Department of Health. So we've done the majority of work before it ever gets to them. The Department of Health is very happy with this process. They've expressed that it works very well and that they would like us to continue it as we have been doing. At the secondary level, it's a little bit different because we don't have exposure the same way that we have, or potential exposure the same way it exists at the elementary level. So we don't quarantine entire classes immediately there. Students, when they are eating, are not eating in the classroom, but we do have to do contact tracing there. We have to speak to the student. We have to speak to sometimes some of the teachers and identify whether or not that student had contact. And usually it would be that that contact took place during a lunch period where they were eating, maybe they were a little too close to somebody else, and then we identify contacts that way. Or if they report to us that there was protocol that was violated and contact did happen and they were in a confined space for a prolonged period of time without a mask on, that has happened as well. We've identified those people and reported them to the Department of Health. As far as busing goes, when we see that a child that has had a positive case has been on a bus, we contact the bus company, we pull that bus from the route, and we have the video of that bus sent to us, and we actually review the videos. So when we look at the video, we can see what time the child got on the bus, whether or not windows were open on the bus, whether or not everybody was masked on the bus, how closely people were sitting to each other, and the time that they were on the bus. Each video has a timestamp, and we can see actually the number of minutes that took place while the children were on the bus. So in some cases, we've had to identify additional people as contacts. In many cases we haven't. Our kids are really behaving very well. When you look at some of these videos on the bus, you cannot believe how well they're behaving, how they're following rules, how they're following protocol. Same thing in the schools. If you walk through our schools now, our kids are doing a phenomenal job. They really are. It's kudos to the staff and to the parents for really drilling into them that they need to follow protocol. And thank you for that. There was a question about numbers and the rise in cases. And I know it seems like, to me, it seems like every 5 minutes we're sending out another letter. But I just want to point something out to everybody. If you go back to September, from September until 7:30 tonight, and you look at all of the cases that we have had in the district, the one thing that we don't have in a database or on a report card, which I think we might be able to work out something so that we do, so people will be able to see it, is that the overwhelming majority of our cases are resolved. So it may feel like we have a lot of cases in the school, but as of 7:30 tonight, throughout the entire district, we had 14 positive COVID cases. Half of our buildings have 0 cases in them. So when you look at the data, what's resolved and what is a current case, like I said, half of our buildings have 0 current cases in them. So that's important data to look at. If you look at the state report card, which is available online, New York State COVID report card, it appears when you look at that there are a lot more cases in the district. But what you have to take into consideration is that it goes all the way back to the beginning of September. We report cases on a daily basis into that report card, but there's no mechanism on the report card to report when the case has resolved and the child or the staff member is now healthy and they're back in school. So to give you, like I said, a better handle on it, we currently have 14 cases that have not resolved yet. I'm trying to think if there was anything else in those questions. Kaneko, if you see anything that I haven't answered.
Let's see, given the recent rise in cases, it's difficult to choose in-person learning at this time for second part of the school year. Would the board consider adding an additional opportunity later in the year, perhaps fourth quarter, to allow students to come back to go to in-person learning?
Dr. Prendergast?
Thank you, Mrs. Berkowitz. I can certainly appreciate the challenge that certain families might face in terms of making this decision. Last July, when we sent out notification to our community with regards to our reopening plan, we did acknowledge the opportunity that we would give families the choice of a pure remote instruction program at the elementary level, as opposed to an in-person model. That took a tremendous amount of work to literally develop 2 parallel educational programs for our children in grades pre-K through grade 5. And yet we made it happen. And we are very, very proud of the work that our teachers and administrators have done to support our students. When we sent that letter in July, we also promised the community that we would ask them again toward the end of the first semester in November, that they would have an opportunity to opt back in. And this is going to create a tremendous amount of work as well, as we look to continue to balance those programs and making sure we can try to find a seat for each child. We don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know what's on the horizon, and I can certainly understand the challenge, but at this point in time, there is no mechanism to look to bring children back at the end of a third marking period, because at that point, we're talking about April. But that being said, we'll certainly take that under advisement. It's still very early in the year, and right now our plans are to try to accommodate as many children as we can for those families who would like their children to return to in-person instruction either in January for our elementary students or at the beginning of the second semester in February 1st or 2nd for our secondary level children.
Thank you. I have one more question that we received ahead of time. I'd like to do that one next. Please read the below statement and question. It says, so I will follow instructions. To the Great Neck Public Schools Board of Ed, superintendent, administrators, teachers, and staff. As in person, parents at Baker, we are so pleased with all of the safety protocols and the creation of the 3 Ws for our children to follow. We appreciate the constant direct communication from the superintendent rather than hearing it through the rumor mill. We've all been and continue to be in this unprecedented time, but are thankful the GNPS district is living up to the reason why we have our children in this district. It is the best. Please know we're very supportive of keeping the schools safe and open for our children. Question. On many occasions and Board of Ed meetings, Dr. Hickey has gone over how the GNPS defines and is handling direct and indirect contact tracing. Can this information be posted on the GNPS homepage where parents and community can readily find it and understand the protocols in place? Email information again to the parents as well. Thank you. Dr. Hickey, part of it will be redundant, but can you tackle that one?
Yeah. So as far as the posting it on the website, it is there on the website, and we've now embedded a link into our communications that go out. Mrs. Berkowitz, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat some of that question for me.
Of course, I loved reading it the first time.
Okay.
Anything specific or the question part?
The question part would be good.
Not the praise? Okay.
No, praise is fine.
On many occasions and Board of Ed meetings, Dr. Hickey has gone over how the GNPS defines and is handling direct and indirect contact tracing. Can this information be posted on the GNPS homepage where parents and community can readily find it and understand the protocols in place? Email information again to the parents as well. Thank you. I believe you've covered it, but
So we call it proximate and close contact. We err on the side of caution when it comes to proximate contact. And we make anybody that we think may have possibly had proximate contact at the elementary level a contact. So I've reviewed that with the Department of Health. I reviewed our process with them. I've reviewed our thinking behind it, and they're in agreement with what we're doing. At the secondary level, there's very little opportunity for proximate contact to take place as long as everybody is following protocol. If they haven't followed protocol and proximate contact has taken place, we're also adding that person to our contact list. Close contact at either the elementary level or the secondary level, those people get added to our list. And close contact, we're defining, we're a little stricter than the CDC. We define it as within 6 feet for 10 minutes or less, not 15 minutes or less. I think that answers that question.
thank you. Dr. Lander and Ms. Langle, have you seen whether or not we've been getting more questions coming in that haven't been answered yet?
Yes, Ms. Berkowitz.
Okay,
Up to what temperature can elementary kids go outside? I think that's for Ms. Newman.
Yes, I'd be happy to answer that. So typically it's 32 degrees, but we also look at the wind chill factor. This school year, we may decide to go a bit lower in temperature, especially if it's a clear sunny day. But again, keeping in mind the wind chill factor, we do want to make sure that we continue to go outside for short periods of time for mask breaks as well as fresh air.
thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, as HIPAA does not apply to schools, what privacy rule, law, or regulation prevents the district from disclosing the name of the student or staff member?
Dr. Prendergast, do you want to start with that one?
I can, and I know our attorney is here as well, and Mr. Feldman could also speak to rules with regards to HIPAA. We do respect the privacy laws of our staff members and our students, such that if someone does test positive for COVID, we respectfully do not violate privacy laws, and therefore we do not identify the names of the individuals in those particular communications.
Mr. Feldman, is there anything you choose to add?
Just that as a school district, we generally are not bound by HIPAA, but we are bound by FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act for student records, and we protect the confidentiality of both all students and staff with respect to any COVID testing, positive or negative.
Thank you. Ms. Langell, anything else?
Yes. Are administrators qualified to do tracing?
While our administrators have not been trained as contact tracers from the Department of Health, we work in conjunction with the Department of Health. So they're not trained contact tracers, but they're trained enough to identify children that have had close or proximate contact. And then we share that the information with the Department of Health. And then the Department of Health actually does the follow-up contact tracing where they're reaching out to the people. So like I said, we haven't had the training that a contact tracer has, but our part in that is that we're identifying people that they've had contact with and then handing it off to the Department of Health. There were also one or two questions in there that I saw. Somebody had asked, what does it mean that a child has not been in school for a prolonged period of time? All letters are not the same. So sometimes you'll see that a letter goes home because we found out that day that a child, had COVID and they were just recently in school. Oftentimes what's happening, and I would say the majority of the cases that we've had are cases where a child has already been quarantined because a family member has COVID. And then that child contracts COVID from somebody in the family. So they've been out of school for sometimes 6, 7, 8 days. And then we get notified. So we're obligated to report the case, even though the child isn't in school. So that's where you'll see that it says the child has not been in for a prolonged period of time. And I have to say, there was another question in there from one of our middle school teachers. And he asked about a message to the community, because there are people in the community that are still violating protocol. And the message to the community is that we need you to be our partners and we need you to work with us. We have an incredibly low infection rate in our schools. And when you look at the fact that we have 6,500 students and 2,000 employees, and I know everybody's not in every day, but we only have 14 current cases of COVID in our schools. That's not the case with the numbers in our community. So the numbers in our community are going up. The Department of Health is watching our community, and they're talking about Great Neck at the state level and at the county level. And I would hate like hell to see that we get shut down because of the behavior of people within the community. So the message is, please be our partners and please work with us and please follow protocol so that we can keep our schools open.
And I want to add to that also, Dr. Hickey, there was a question with regards to spread. And we are proud of the work that we're doing to date, in such that any cases of positive COVID infections are not a result of an infection in school for students. So again, we are working and pleading with our community to work in tandem with us so that we can keep our children and our staff members safe. We recognize the fact that all of our protocols are being followed in school with regards to the prevention of the spread. And again, we just continue to hope that our community works with us so that we can protect our children and our staff.
Thank you. We don't see whether or not questions have been submitted this way. So again, I'll turn to you, Ms. Langell. Is there anything else?
Yes, I think these are more for Dr. Hickey. What does cases resolved mean? And what does the proximate contact at the secondary level look like?
So that was a term that I used. I don't know what the actual definition of it is. My intention behind using that term was that somebody has contracted COVID. They've gone through a period of time where they were either asymptomatic and then tested negative, or they were symptomatic and then resolved, and they've been cleared by their healthcare provider or the Department of Health to come back to work or school. So that's what my definition of resolved was. And then what was the other question, Kanika?
What does proximate contact at the secondary level look like?
So an example of proximate contact could be a couple of people in an office that they took their masks off. They weren't in there for a long period of time, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, but they were in an enclosed space and it wasn't very ventilated. I would consider that proximate contact. It's erring again on the side of caution. They didn't have close contact, but we are identifying anybody that has proximate contact as a contact of a positive case and giving that information to the Department of Health. They've kind of merged the two now. Early things have really evolved as we've been doing this. It was a clear delineation early on between close and proximate contact. Now we're really kind of just calling it contact, and we're making anybody that had, any type of proximate contact a contact.
Are there any other questions?
Yes. Can you clarify what is the percentage threshold that would make going to remote instruction mandatory for our district?
I could try. I was talking to the Department of Health today about this, and again, everything's constantly evolving. So they're looking at our numbers. They're looking at what happened in New York City, where there's disagreement whether the mayor should have closed schools or not now, because they went strictly by that 3% 7-day rolling average. And there's a lot of people that are upset about that now, because you have schools in the city that have done a phenomenal job that have no cases in them, and now they're closed, and now the kids are going to be back in the homes where the infection rates are rising. So if you think about it that way, it doesn't necessarily make sense to close the safest place for children. And we've been having those discussions with the Department of Health. They look at our numbers and they see how incredibly low the percentage rate is of infection in our buildings. And then they look at the percentage of infection rate in the community. And, it just doesn't really make sense to say that we're going to not have kids come to a place that there is no real infection spreading within the building. So it's evolving. It's not a decision that we will make. It's a decision that the Department of Health at the Nassau County and state level will make. I know that they're looking at how they're going to make that decision if it is made. If it's made, we'll have to abide by the rules that are set for us. If we go yellow, we may be told at that time that we have to close our schools and we have to go remote. It's a wait and see for us.
Thank you. Ms. Langell?
Yes. For secondary schools, Plainview allows students back to hybrid with 3-day notice. Why can't Great Neck?
Mr.
I
Feldman
can't.
or Dr.
Sorry.
Prendergast?
Yes, thank you. I certainly cannot speak to the protocols of another school district, but we were very intentional about the decisions that we had made in the summer leading up to the reopening of school. Keep in mind, we were also very cautious about the hybrid model in terms of students enrolled in an A-day, B-day model and protecting those cohorts, and to minimize the amount of interaction with other students within those clearly defined schedules.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes. How do we trust that the Department of Health is not doing tracing in our schools?
I'm not sure I understand that.
I could try to answer it. I'm not sure what the question is, but we can be pretty confident that the Department of Health is following through with what they're supposed to be doing. Sometimes they're a little slow in getting there because they are overwhelmed. There are many, many cases in Nassau County, but I talk to them every day and we review our cases every day. We look at our new cases. We look at cases that are currently being traced. They have a database that they pull up that they can see whether or not people are being compliant with the tracing. And there's many variables in there, but you can be sure that they are following up with any of the information that we provide to them.
Are there any other questions?
Yes. Regarding the safety protocol, if one of the children in a family is asked to quarantine because of someone in his or her class, shouldn't all the children in this family stay home until they test negative before returning to school?
No, that's not the guidance from the Department of Health or the CDC. That sibling of the possible contact is a contact of a contact. That's in the slide presentation if you'd like to go back and look at it. And contacts of contacts do not have to quarantine.
Okay, I'll keep going, Ms. Berkowitz, if that's okay.
Sure.
What happened at JFK early education, and if it was closed for COVID-related issues, why didn't we get notification?
I didn't hear the first part of the question.
It says, what happened at JFK early education, and if it was closed for COVID-related issues, why didn't we get notification?
I'm not sure what that question is asked. Is it, if that question is talking about the Fund for Force program, a notification went out yesterday, and we did switch that program over to remote education.
Okay. We know how much. Okay, we got. Okay, what is the reason the school district is not considering a proactive remote only period following the holiday break?
In my opinion, the process that we have in place is better than having an entire school shut down. We have a process where we go to remote if there is a case and there's been any possibility of close or proximate contact. It's demonstrated that it works up until this point. Like I said, we've been at this since September, and on today at almost 8 o'clock, we have 14 cases in total, staff and students in the district. So that shows that what we're doing works. And up until this point, it's been successful. If there were a change in that and we were to get a spike in cases in a building, or it was shown that the processes that we have in place are no longer working, we might pivot. We use that word a lot this year. We pivot all over the place. So we might consider that if the data changed, but right now with the data that we have, that really wouldn't make too much sense to me.
And Dr. Hickey, I would concur with everything that you had said. In speaking with other Nassau County superintendents, we are all of a position right now where the safest place for students and staff is in school. And again, it's being mindful of making sure that all of our protocols that are in our plan are strictly followed. But as we said, we will stand by the data and we will be watching the numbers closely within Nassau County as well as within our own local school community.
So there was a question about mask wearing and our staff that I also saw. Our staff, as with our students, should be wearing masks in the buildings. I'm not going to say at all times, but at all times that they're in a room where there's other people. If people are in an office by themselves or in a workspace that is cordoned off by themselves, then it would be appropriate for them to not have a mask on. But anytime that they come in contact with people, everybody should have a mask on.
So on the topic of masks, another question is sending children out for mask breaks is great, but when it gets very cold, would that be a factor for kids to catch cold?
Sure, it would be a factor. If we're under 32 degrees and we determine that it's way too cold for kids to go outside, we would have to have mask breaks in a large open space within the building, such as a cafeteria or a gymnasium. But I mean, I know it was cold yesterday, today, but our winters recently have been pretty mild. So let's hope for a mild winter and that we'll be able to keep our kids going outside as much as possible.
Okay, if a remote student is positive, do those students get reported and make it to those letters that are sent?
So you don't get a letter sent home notifying you, but we do report that positive student on the report card.
Right. If you look at the New York State COVID report card site for the Great Neck Public Schools, you will see categories for on-site versus off-site, and it's broken down by staff as well as by students. And obviously that's data strictly for the Great Neck Public Schools, although there is a greater reporting tabulation for children who reside within the Great Neck community under the age of 18, but do not attend the public school system. Those numbers are recorded separately.
Okay. What if parents have been identified COVID positive and they don't report it and send their kids to school? How can we prevent this?
Shame on them. If they do something like that, seriously, shame on them. And if you know of somebody like that, please let us know and we will take care of it. Those children will be quarantined. The Department of Health will be informed and the appropriate follow-up will take place.
Thank you, Dr. Gee. And that is so very important because if an individual is tested positive, the Department of Health makes it very clear with regards to their expectations for the patient to be isolated and for anyone within the immediate household to be in quarantine. So that is so very important because we want to make sure that, again, with our communications of the Department of Health, if there is a violation that could impact the health and safety of our buildings, if you let us know about it, we will let the Department of Health know about it as well.
Okay, I believe this question was already answered in a previous board meeting. When a student or staff member is quarantined, why doesn't the school make it mandatory to be tested? Shouldn't everyone be required to have a negative test result in order to return to school?
So we don't have the authority to mandate testing at this point. So we can't do that, but there are processes in place where if a child does test positive, that we have mandated that they be cleared by their healthcare provider or the Department of Health before returning to school. And in order for that to happen, they would have had to have gone through an isolation period. They would have had to have been symptom-free for 72 hours or more. And then their healthcare provider or the Department of Health would have had to clear them to come back to school.
Okay. Can you please consider having COVID info buttons on the district site as well as on all school websites that would bring the website visitor to a simple FAQ and flowcharts like New York State had recently issued about what to do if one's child has any kind of illness symptoms? It appears that simple COVID information and instructions are not front and center for parents to find.
Dr. Prendergast, would you take that one?
Yes, thank you for that question. We look to provide the community with as much information as possible. Our school website is very robust. And because of that, sometimes information is not as easily found. We do have information on the website and was shared with the community from the Department of Health with regards to the toolkit. You may remember it was a flow chart in terms of what parents needed to do in terms of their child or an adult within their home had symptoms. That being said, we certainly will take a look at our website again to make sure that the most pertinent information is available to the residents. Everything is found on the school reopening plan. And then if you look on the left side of the toolbar, you'll find additional information with regards to COVID, contact tracing, and things of that nature. But we appreciate the suggestion and we will certainly look into it.
As well, every letter that you send out has the opportunity to go ahead and get the information very clearly and easily.
That's right, Mrs. Berkowitz. We do, for the sake of transparency, also post every incident. That's right. Thank you.
Right. Ms. Langell?
Yes. Do the numbers and contact tracing reveal the major source of transmission?
I mean,
Dr. Hickey, would you like that one?
yeah, they have in the past, they have pointed to sources of transmission. You know, we've had some large gatherings in the community and you can look 5 to 7 days after those large gatherings and people that we know attended those gatherings testing positive in, you know, numbers, the parents, not kids. We had like, I guess, groups of like 5 to 7 cases that could be linked back to those gatherings. So yes, it has happened.
Ms. Langell?
Yes. Why does the Board of Ed not post a public agenda prior to the meeting? It is indeed posted. It's posted the morning before a meeting. Can the
It is
district,
only developed a few days before, so it's not like anything is being held back.
right. Can the district consider requiring a COVID testing for students after the breaks and before returning to school? I think this was,
We went through that already.
okay. What, if any, changes to school protocols will be made to adhere to health safety requirements with the colder weather?
We're gonna, I believe, keep almost all of the protocols that we have in place. We are going to turn up the heat because we're not going to be able to close the windows. I know that people, sometimes get a little chilly with the windows cracked open, but part of our process is that we're going to have windows open even throughout the winter. So I don't think there's too much that's going to change. In inclement weather or very cold weather, taking kids outside will not be an option. So that would be one of the changes that I would see, but we would arrange mask breaks in appropriate rooms within the building.
If we do go remote, would it be beneficial to have a dry run, particularly at the elementary level, and have a practice day at home? I think that's from Ms. Newman.
Sure. So our in-person classroom teachers have been working with our elementary students since the start of the school year to acclimate them to the ways in which a day of remote learning would happen. We have a one-to-one iPad initiative in place at every grade level, and students have been taught how to log on to and manage Seesaw in grades K through 2, Google Classroom in grades 3 through 5, and any other programs they will need to rely upon for remote instruction and learning.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I just want to extend to that because I saw another question that would be tagged to that, I think, Mrs. Langell. If someone had asked if we ended up going remote, how long would that be? And would we potentially go remote for the rest of the school year? That is not our intention. Ideally, our goal is to keep our schools open. However, if we were in a situation where we needed to switch or pivot to remote instruction, it really would depend on the circumstance. If it was because we needed to do contact tracing beyond what we normally do, we might close for a day or two. If we were needing to close because we had an extensive spread, then we might follow protocols from the Department of Health, which would warrant a period of time for isolation and or quarantine, which could be 10 to 14 days. So I don't want to give anyone a hard or fast number because it really will depend on the unique circumstance for the particular building. And then of course, if decisions are made at a county or state level, that certainly would be out of our control.
If a child has been tested for COVID and waiting results, can his or her sibling go to school?
There's a lot of different variables on that one. If that person wants to reach out to me directly, I could discuss all the half a dozen of them. Just email me, and I think it would take too long to go through all the variables. The answer is yes and no, based upon the variables of the situation. There was one other thing that I just wanted to say. I noticed some of the follow-up questions. I don't want people to think that we're not being 100% transparent. So there is one case of students where it's possible that there was transmission from a student to a student. And there are 2 cases of staff members where it's possible that there was transmission from a staff member to a staff member. What I did say before was the overwhelming majority of our cases, like 99% or 98%, have not been transmission within the schools. But there is a possibility that there was slight transmission within the schools. I don't want people to think that we're trying to hide anything.
Students are reporting traveling over the holiday break. What procedures will be in place to prevent these students from immediately re-entering the schools after air travel?
New York State has made the laws very clear with regard to travel restrictions. If someone travels to a non-contiguous state, there is a mandated quarantine period of 14 days. However, New York State has also put into play very specific protocols which could lessen the period of quarantine, and that it would only be the case if an individual were to test immediately prior to leaving their destination upon return to New York, They would still have to quarantine for 3 days upon arriving to New York. And then on the 4th day, they would need to go for a test and then wait for the results of that test. If and only if those 2 separate exams both bring back a negative result, then someone could be cleared from quarantine. Now, there is absolutely no way for us to know with great certainty what anyone's travel plans are, but we are appealing to the community to be honest, to be transparent, to be respectful of our residents and our community members and our neighbors and our friends. And if you are going to travel, please stay home and respect the New York State travel advisory restrictions. Do not put anyone else's health at risk until you are cleared from quarantine to safely return to school.
And like with everything else, that's going on the assumption that you're asymptomatic. And I believe that the test has to be done within 3 days of returning. The
That's
first
correct, Ms.
COVID
Berkowitz.
test, right?
You have to have 3 days home, and then on the 4th day, you are
Right,
permitted then to
right.
sit for the exam.
But I'm talking about the test before you,
Correct.
right, return. Ms. Langell?
On that same note, following up on the parent that asked what happens if a parent doesn't report their COVID positive test case and how do we prevent that? Where is the clear instruction or procedure for parents to do this? The administration is living this day in and day out and clearly very knowledgeable, but I feel we're not disseminating enough info and instructions.
I think the instruction was to go ahead and call either Dr. Hickey, Dr. Prendergast, if you know of a case like this.
But the other, I think what she's asking too, how do the parents know? And then when the parents get tested, they are told at that time by whoever does the testing for them that you need to report this to the schools. If it's a PCR test, the Department of Health eventually will report it to us, but there's a real long time lag there. So they're asked at that time, or they're supposed to be, when they test positive, do you have children in the schools? And if so, please report it to the school district.
And just adding to there was a question that I noticed about if a teacher in our district were to know with certainty that a family had traveled over the break, then certainly there would be an expectation that that child would not be returning to school because they'd be in a quarantine period. If there was a situation where a child were to arrive at school when a teacher knows for a fact that they shouldn't be, it is imperative that it's immediately reported to the building principal so that the parents will be advised to immediately come to school to pick up their child and to take them home, because we do not want, as I said earlier, to have children coming to school when they shouldn't be in school and then risking the health and safety of others.
The school should use the community infection rate rather than the school infection rate to measure the risk of spread. Are there any plans for testing in school, even just randomly like New York City?
Not at this time. We do not have that procedure in place. New York City has a very different set of protocols. And again, we are relying on the data in school because we are not looking at transmission rates in school the way you may see it in a public community at large.
I hear masks are not enforced in the lunchroom even when kids aren't eating.
I would simply ask you to report that immediately to your building administrator if you think that is to be true, because we do, again, fully expect everyone to adhere to the policies that we have put into play to keeping children safe.
On the New York State report card website, Great Neck has a much higher case count than other neighboring schools, with the exception of Port Washington. How are you certain that your policies are working?
Because we only have 14 children in our schools right now that have COVID, and the percentage of infection rate is extremely low. When you look at that report card, it's not just the children that are in the public schools, it's all of the children in the zip code. So I can tell you that our public schools are doing a very good job and our infection rate is extremely low.
Is it possible to use rapid testing at the schools for secondary levels?
Not at this time.
Now that the weather is getting colder and kids tend to have more colds, how do you handle that if they come to school and possibly could be COVID?
The nurses have discretion on their judgment when they evaluate a child, and they look to see whether or not the symptoms are symptoms that are representative of possible COVID case. They err on the side of caution. If they do think that the symptoms are indicative of a potential COVID case, they will be sending that child home.
I also noticed, Dr. Hickey, there was a question with regards to why does the school district allow students to return to school 10 days after testing positive when other places are requiring 14 days? The reality is it is not the school district that makes that determination. That determination comes from the Department of Health. Legally, it is the Department of Health that places someone in quarantine or isolation, and only the Department of Health can release someone from quarantine or isolation. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
And where they're that 10-day, 14-day discrepancy, it's kind of silly, but if you are the primary person that gets COVID and you resolve, the Department of Health will clear you prior to clearing somebody that's just in quarantine. So it's a glitch in the system almost, but it is something that the Department of Health does do. They do clear people after 10 days if they're primary.
Is it true that the schools cannot require parents to get their kids COVID tested? And if so, why not? For example, if there's a child who has to quarantine due to a positive parent, why can we not tell the family to test the student so we know whether or not the child was in school but perhaps asymptomatic?
Most of our families are getting their kids tested. We can't require that they test, but there is a process that they have to go through, a quarantine process, where the contact tracing is done through the Department of Health, and the Department of Health determines that that child has been symptom-free for 72 hours and has fulfilled their 14-day quarantine. And then the Department of Health will give a release for that child to come back to school.
And that answers, Dr. Hickey, another question that was posted about someone asking about once a student is tested and they're waiting for results, how does the district ensure that the students remain out of school? Again, we are waiting for the results from the Department of Health. And I do want to take this opportunity to also give a shout out to all of our school nurses. Our school nurses deserve a huge shout out and a round of applause for all that they've been doing in terms of communicating with our parents and our administrators and our teachers in terms of keeping records, keeping track of all of our students, answering the multitude of questions that parents have, and reassuring our parents when their children are symptomatic, whether it's for COVID or whether it's for the flu or an earache, that they're in good hands and that they're giving them good advice in terms of seeing their healthcare providers so that we can do all that we can to maintain the well-being of our children.
Dr. Hickey just mentioned that there is one possible case of spread from a student to another student. Is this potential case in the elementary school or secondary? Any context about how it may have spread would be useful.
Since there's only one case, I can't really talk about where it is because it would be too easy to reveal the person that was positive. So no, I can't really discuss that. I can tell you that there's only one possible or potential case that we've identified in students, and there are a couple of potential cases with staff, but I don't want to get into which buildings they were at.
Okay. I think that concludes our questions. I have two other comments that I'd like to read. Thank you, Dr. Prendergast and Dr. Hickey, for your very clear answers. I really appreciate it. And just wanted to say thank you so much for all your hard work and keeping our kids safe and healthy. We all truly appreciate everything you do.
Thank
You said there were
Thank you.
two, or did I not
that-
hear you?
That was
Okay.
those two.
Okay. Since there's nothing else now for open time, it's board discussion. And I actually have something I'd like to say. I did not want to interrupt the flow of the questions that were coming in prior during open time, but there is one statement I'd really like to make. The question had been asked about divulging the name of the person or persons who have tested positive. There's a reason for doing tracing, which is being done even before the Department of Health says to do it. This district really does a tremendous job with contact tracing, with supplying the information, and so on. But our children and our staff also deserve privacy. And as we're doing this, I can't see truly what the purpose would be in divulging this. We had something very similar years ago where people were asking names for other children about one particular issue. If we weren't doing the good job that we are to make sure to know who else may have been exposed to this child, it would be a different story. But as you said, at best, there may be one case of a child to a child transmission at best, and we're not even positive yet about that. I can't see any, not only any good coming of it, but I think you need to remember this could be your child, or your child's teacher, or your spouse who's a teacher. And I really think that the days of exiling lepers to a separate colony are a different story. We're doing everything that can be done, truly, to go ahead and curtail anything. And I think our numbers show this. But there's also a responsibility on our community and on our community members. We can't do this. We used to say you cannot legislate good behavior. All we can do is hope that everybody is thinking that this could be their child, their spouse, or whomever, and try to do the right thing. There's nothing to be gained by trying to sneak around the system, whether it be going to a large event or not disclosing if you or somebody you know has COVID. This is something that I think we all have a responsibility to pull together about it. And I'm sorry if I sounded like I'm lecturing or whatever, but it just, I think we have to remember then that it would be no good could come out of divulging who it is specifically. People know, people talk about it. It's all over Facebook the second a letter comes home where everybody's speculating about it, but I just wanted to have my 2 cents. Is there anything else for board discussion? No? Okay. Our next meeting is going to be on December 16th. Be notified about the location and the time on our website. And since this is our last meeting for November, I hope you all have a lovely Thanksgiving and stay safe. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Can I just make a comment before we adjourn, Mrs. Berkowitz?
I invited everybody for board discussion. Go ahead.
This is Mrs. Sassooni. I just want to thank the community who stayed on for this meeting, which we have a record number of people in attendance at this board meeting, which to me demonstrates the great deal of concern among all our stakeholder groups, people's goodwill and intent to see this through for our staff, for our children. And it really does take all of our collective efforts, as Mrs. Berkowitz said. And I just want to urge that for all of us who were on this meeting, who understand all the complexities that Dr. Prendergast and Dr. Hickey and all of our staff are dealing with, our nurses, in order to educate children, we really all have to be in this together. So thank you for staying on the meeting. And now I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Before you do such, I'd like to remind everybody, you're not censored at this point, that you cannot continue to ask questions. We deliberately asked that people go ahead and submit their questions in advance. There were all of 3 people who responded and at least 50 people who had questions here during the meeting. But if you continue to have any questions, if they weren't either answered or if you thought of them afterwards, by all means, you can still contact anyone you wish. Everybody knows the address for administrators, and you can contact our secretary if there's any question or comment that needs to be made to the board. Now, Mrs. Sassooni,
Motion to adjourn.
good night, everybody.
Night.